Welcome, friends. Today I would like to tell you the tale of the Brownie clan and the evil land developer. The Scottish Highlands, a place of ancient magic and mist-shrouded mountains. Here, the old ways never truly died, and the veil between our world and the other world remains thin. In these remote glens, brownies, those small, helpful household spirits, still find refuge with families who respect the old traditions. Mrs. Fraser's farm sat nestled in a secluded valley near Loch Morra, surrounded by heather-covered hills. The stone farmhouse had stood for over 3 centuries, its walls thick with history and secrets. The Fraser family had worked this land since before the Highland clearances, maintaining an unspoken pact with the Brownie clan that dwelled within their home. At 82, Eleanor Fraser was the last of her bloodline. Her husband Malcolm had passed 5 winters ago, and their only son had been claimed by the Loch decades earlier. Yet she was never truly alone. The MacTavish Brownie clan, led by the ancient Tavish MacTavish and his wife Kirsty, had watched over generations of Frasers. Tavish, with his leathery skin and eyes that had witnessed centuries pass, stood barely 2 feet tall. His clan of 17 brownies lived in the forgotten spaces of the farmhouse, behind walls, beneath floorboards, inside unused cupboards. By night, they emerged to mend fences, churn butter, tend to sick animals, and keep the hearth warm. Their only payment, a small bowl of cream left by the kitchen door and the respect of never being directly acknowledged. Summer 2022 arrived with unusual warmth. The heather bloomed early, and Mrs. Fraser's small herd of Highland cattle grazed contentedly on the verdant slopes. The Brownie clan had just finished their spring cleaning of the farm's outbuildings when the black Range Rover first appeared on the narrow dirt track leading to the farmhouse. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the rural surroundings. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, collected mud as he approached the ancient wooden door. Mrs. Fraser answered his confident knock, her weathered face showing mild surprise at the unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Fraser? I'm Richard Potter, CEO of Solaris Development." His London accent cut through the Highland air like a foreign intrusion. "May I come in? I have a proposition that could change your life." From the shadows behind the grandfather clock, Tavish MacTavish watched with ancient, suspicious eyes. Potter explained his vision. Acres of solar panels harvesting energy from the Highland sun, bringing green progress to this underutilized land. He offered a sum that would have made most elderly farmers sign immediately, enough to live comfortably in a city apartment for the remainder of her days. "This land isn't for sale, Mr. Potter," Mrs. Fraser said simply. "It never has been, and it never will be." Potter's smile remained fixed, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I understand your attachment, Mrs. Fraser, but at your age, managing this place must be challenging. Think about it. Here's my card." As the door closed behind him, Mrs. Fraser didn't notice the small brownie who had crept along the baseboard to listen. Kirsty MacTavish, her gray hair tied with heather stems, frowned deeply as she scurried back to report to her husband. That night, as Mrs. Fraser slept, the Brownie clan gathered in the kitchen. "He smells of greed and iron," Tavish declared, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "The old magic cannot abide where he would build his metal forest." "The Fraser blood has protected us for centuries," Kirsty added. "If she leaves, where shall we go? The old places are vanishing." The youngest brownies trembled. They had heard tales of Brownie clans forced from their homes, wandering homeless or fading away entirely as concrete covered their sacred grounds. Potter returned the following week and the week after. Each time, his offers grew larger and his demeanor less pleasant. The brownies watched from mouse holes and behind curtains as his true nature emerged. "You're being foolish, Mrs. Fraser," he snapped during his 4th visit. "This land is worth nothing compared to what I'm offering. You can't farm it properly anymore." "My family has worked this land for 12 generations, Mr. Potter," she replied calmly. "We've weathered worse than smooth-talking businessmen." After Potter left, slamming his car door hard enough to startle the roosting hens, Mrs. Fraser sat in her rocking chair by the fire. The house was quiet, but she knew she wasn't alone. "I know you're listening," she said softly to the empty room. "You've always been here, helping, watching. My grandmother told me never to speak directly to you, but times are changing. I think we need to talk." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Tavish McTavish emerged from behind the bookcase. His ancient eyes regarded her cautiously. 300 years we've served the Fraser blood," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "Never have we been called upon directly." "These are unusual times, Master McTavish," Mrs. Fraser replied. "That man will not stop. I fear what he might do next." More brownies appeared from under the sofa behind the curtains through a small crack in the wainscoting. Soon, the room held the entire clan, their eyes reflecting the firelight like cats. They talked long into the night, breaking centuries of tradition. The brownies shared their fears of displacement, while Mrs. Fraser confessed her worries about holding onto the farm alone. "We will protect what is ours," Tavish declared finally, "as we always have." The following week brought the first act of sabotage. Mrs. Fraser found 3 of her cows sick, frothing at the mouth. The local vet confirmed poisoning but couldn't identify the source. The vegetable garden withered overnight, the plants blackened as if touched by frost in the middle of summer. Anonymous phone calls came at all hours. Strange men in unmarked vans drove slowly past the property. Mrs. Fraser's milk couldn't be sold after the dairy found contamination in the samples. Through it all, the Brownie clan watched and planned. One morning, Mrs. Fraser found a dead crow on her doorstep, its neck broken. Attached to its leg was a note. "Accidents happen to stubborn old women." That evening, she wrote a letter and left it where she knew Tavish would find it. The next morning, an invitation was ready to be posted. Elegant handwriting on cream stationery, inviting Mr. Potter to dinner to discuss terms. Potter arrived precisely at 8, bringing along a burly man introduced simply as Mr. Smith. Smith's neck was thick as a tree trunk, his knuckles scarred from fights. He carried a briefcase that seemed too small for his massive hands. "I'm pleased you've come to your senses, Mrs. Fraser," Potter said as she led them into the dining room. The table was set with the family's best china and silver, candles casting dancing shadows across the walls. "I'm an old woman, Mr. Potter," she replied. "Perhaps it's time to consider my future." The meal began pleasantly enough. Cock-a-leekie soup followed by venison with neeps and tatties. Potter talked incessantly about his plans for the property, barely touching his food in his excitement. "We'll begin clearing the old structures immediately," he said, sipping his wine. "The farmhouse will have to go, of course. It's not historically significant enough to preserve." Mrs. Fraser nodded, her face unreadable. "More wine, gentlemen?" As she poured, Smith opened the briefcase, revealing contracts. "Just sign here, Mrs. Fraser. Initial each page." Potter's smile turned predatory. "I should mention the offer has been adjusted to reflect current market conditions. The figure is somewhat lower than initially discussed." "How much lower?" Mrs. Fraser asked quietly. 60%, Potter replied. "Still generous for land this remote." Mrs. Fraser set down her glass. "I see." "Look," Potter's voice hardened. "Let's drop the pretense. You're going to sell, one way or another. Is that a threat, Mr. Potter?" "It's reality. An elderly woman alone on an isolated farm. Accidents happen, fires start, people fall." Smith cracked his knuckles meaningfully. Mrs. Fraser's eyes narrowed. "I am not alone, Mr. Potter." "Your imaginary friends won't help you, old woman," Potter laughed. Mrs. Fraser stood suddenly. "Now!" she shouted. The candles extinguished simultaneously. Darkness engulfed the room, broken only by moonlight filtering through the windows. Then came the sounds, hundreds of tiny feet scurrying across floors, up walls, across the ceiling. Small, hard hands gripped Potter and Smith from every direction. Potter's scream cut through the darkness, followed by Smith's deeper bellow. There was thrashing, the sound of breaking china, desperate pleas that dissolved into gurgling noises. Then, silence. When Mrs. Fraser relit the candles, she sat alone at the head of the table, calmly sipping her wine. The contracts lay scattered across the floor. Of Potter and Smith, there was no sign except for Smith's empty shoe beneath the table. In the corners of the room, shadows moved purposefully, tiny hands collecting broken dishes, wiping spilled wine. The following morning dawned bright and clear. Mrs. Fraser walked to the pig pen carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Her 6 Gloucester Old Spot pigs grunted eagerly as she approached. "You're in for a treat today, my dears," she cooed, patting their bristly heads. "The McTavish clan has prepared something special. They've taken their share, of course, payment for services rendered." She uncovered the basket, revealing bloody chunks of meat. As she scattered them into the trough, the pigs fell upon the feast with enthusiastic snorts. "Mr. Potter was right about one thing," she murmured. "This land will indeed produce energy, just not the kind he imagined." That night, as Mrs. Fraser knitted by the fire, Tavish McTavish appeared at her side. "It is done," he said. "The bodies will never be found." "Thank you, old friend," she replied. "Your clan has served the Frasers well." Tavish's ancient eyes gleamed. "The contract goes both ways. Your blood protects our home. We protect your blood." Mrs. Fraser nodded, then hesitated. "There's something I should tell you, Tavish. Something I've never told anyone." The brownie waited silently. "I have no children, as you know. When I die, the Fraser line ends." She set down her knitting. "But I've made arrangements. This farm will become a nature preserve. No development, no building. Protected forever." Tavish's wrinkled face remained impassive. "And the house?" "Maintained as is. A caretaker will live here, someone who understands the old ways. I've chosen her already, my grandniece. She believes in your kind." The brownie nodded slowly. "Then our pact continues." "There's one more thing," Mrs. Fraser added. "Potter wasn't working alone. His company will send others when he doesn't return." Tavish's mouth curved into what might have been a smile, revealing teeth sharp as needles. "We will be waiting. The McTavish clan has protected this land since before humans built stone circles. We will continue to do so." As if on cue, headlights appeared on the distant track leading to the farm. "So soon," Mrs. Fraser murmured. "They are eager to join their master," Tavish replied, slipping back into the shadows. All around the house, tiny eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching, waiting. Mrs. Fraser picked up her knitting again, counting stitches as the car approached. The brownies had grown hungry again, and the pigs would need feeding tomorrow. In the darkness outside, something small darted across the driveway. The approaching car swerved suddenly, then continued more slowly. The driver couldn't be sure, but he thought he'd seen a child standing by the road, a small figure with ancient eyes that reflected the headlights like a cat's. The McTavish clan was ready for visitors.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.